Hi everyone, I hope I am live. I'm gonna let people start to join, but this morning I'm going to be in conversation with Isaias Hernandez, who handle is queer brown vegan. I'm just gonna add a little pinned comment so we know what we're talking about. Hopefully I can pin that. Yeah, okay, cool. I'm just gonna get Isaias up. Okay, bear with us.
Hi, Bonnie.
Hello, hi, how are you?
I'm doing really well. What about
Good.
yourself?
I'm good. Where are you? Are we both in the morning time where we are?
Yeah, I'm in Los Angeles right now, so it's like 10 a.m. now.
Okay, cool. Me too.
Cool, awesome.
Yeah.
It's very
Thank you so
cloudy.
much for, I know it's pretty scary. Thank you for joining me in conversation. I will let you first introduce yourself, but I guess, yeah, I wanted to just say that I would guess I was drawn to be in conversation with you. I feel like the way that you've been sort of describing different things within the climate and the education around that to be very engaging and thoughtful, and I think it's been good for like all, it meets people at all levels of like where they are with their relationship with the climate crisis and what they can do
Mhm.
about it. So I'm sure everyone will be inspired to check out your page after our conversation, but I highly recommend that if you want to kind of educate yourself around some climate sort of terminology and issues. But I would love to hear just, yeah, what sort of a bit about yourself. I know you just said you're in LA, but yeah, and maybe what brought you into this kind of dialogue, whether that was through passion, choice, or necessity of experience.
Mhm.
I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, no, thank you so much again for having me. And yeah, so I grew up here in Los Angeles actually my whole life. And so I grew up predominantly in the San Fernando Valley. And so 818 represents. So for me growing up, I lived nearby a lot of toxic facilities and next to the Metrolink. And
Mm-hmm.
so for me growing up, I was already in low income housing that is usually through Section 8. And so generally those houses are in low income areas where you're nearby polluted sites. And so
Mm-hmm.
for me growing up, I always had a lot of questions of why my environment looked this way. Why is it that when I went to the school that was a few cities in the valley that was more predominantly richer, had more access to resources, had cleaner air, access to clean water? Like, why was this the case? And so I think growing up at a young age, being low income, I really saw my own eco-friendly values within my family as sense of survival. Like we didn't
Mm-hmm.
really live because we wanted to be, I guess you would say, sustainable. It was more about this is a way to survive, this is how to be resourceful, and being thankful for what you have. And so that stemmed my curiosity. And it wasn't until elementary school, late elementary, where I was doing conservation programs with, I think, Heal the Bay, that's in LA.
Mm-hmm.
And so I remember going to beach cleanups as field trips for a younger child and just seeing the amount of environmental conservationists that were doing this work that I was so inspired to look more into what environmentalism was. Unfortunately, many of the things that I saw is that educators never looked like me. And so I always thought about like, oh, why is this the case? Like, why is no one pursuing this type of career? And so as I got older in middle school, I started learning about climate change and all these things, but I never understood how it interconnected to my own identity, my own values, and where I came from. And
Mm-hmm.
so as you know, high school came around, people were asking like, where are you going to go? Where are you applying to? What do you want to do? And I was like so confused because I was so conflicted of like what I really wanted to do. And so I said, I want to study the environment and people. And a lot of my
Mm-hmm.
friends laughed and said like, how are you going to make a living off of that? Or like, what future do you see for that? And I was like,
Yeah.
well, I care about the people and the environment. So why not? I put myself through this program. So I ended up moving to Berkeley up in Northern California and did environmental science there. And that's when I realized how much of the academic background, I guess biological and physical sciences provided me to understand the
Mm-hmm.
processes that happened. But socially, from an environmental perspective, I understood all of these terminologies that I realized, wow, this is everything that I experienced, but I never had the right words for it. I
Mm-hmm.
just had the emotions and feelings of confusion and anger felt upon, but I didn't know how to express it. And so, leaving college and everything, I realized that I had so much information that was in my own knowledge and my own experiences that I said, why don't I share this information to other people that are just interested in learning about the environment? Very simplistic ways to talk about climate change. And so I started it and instilled my personal lived experiences through it. And so through that, I gained a community of people who really engage with my content positively in ways how they can engage with the climate crisis through an educational lens and
Mm-hmm.
not to feel overburdened with all of these terminology that are sometimes
Yeah.
thrown out there.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. It's like, you know, you obviously that's a great opportunity to go and study and go and really deep dive into these terms. And I still think even within a kind of formal environment as college or school, I think still sometimes there can be barriers of really comprehending these like big kind of things. And also
Mm-hmm.
I think there's so much that often we all gravitate towards more nuanced or smaller kind of subjects within the broad spectrum of the climate crisis. Obviously there's is an
Mm-hmm.
overwhelming amount. I mean, that was really my way in to it was really through sort of ocean health and single-use plastics. And I think the minute you open one thing, you realize how interconnected everything is, and you can't not look at that without then looking, you know, you can't just look at sort of the trash of that. You've got to also look at like, what about the facilities where that, you know, petrochemicals are made, and what about the neighboring communities to that
Mm-hmm.
facility and factory? Not only then the sort of towns that maybe get polluted with the physical trash itself. So it is, yeah, it's obviously a deep rooted and layered you know, story. And I think even with the terminology, like you can learn it, but then it's like, what do you do with it? I think that's always like the
Yeah.
hard thing I struggle with, this idea that you learn these systems, whether they're good systems, broken systems, and then it's like, how do you and what do you do to like best approach it? And I think there's so many multiple I mean, that the analogy I always think of with single-use plastics is like, imagine if you imagine like a bath was overfilling with water. It's like, do you turn the
Mm-hmm.
tap off, or do you start kind of emptying the bath? And it's like both. You know, we need to
Yeah.
turn the tap off with more new plastic, but also get the plastic out of the water that exists. So it's an interesting layered way. I mean, do you find? I mean, obviously I have found from experiencing your stuff that you're, you know, naturally obviously a very good communicator and storyteller through the kind of educational way that you look at I guess your community and how you connect with people. But is there do you find you take on a natural role within the kind of social change? I think what's really important to always highlight is that like a lot of people don't necessarily want to be leaders within this space, but maybe they're, you know, they're great storytellers, organizers, caretakers. Like there's so many different roles I think we can all take. And I think just because we've had this stereotypical idea of like an activist or environmentalist, I think it's great that like those sort of rigid stereotypes are kind of being broken, and it shows that like
Mm-hmm.
everyone is needed in this dialogue. And it doesn't mean to say you have to be like the front facing kind of type of person. Do you find yourself like, I know there are some things that like I find really overwhelming and I don't want to do, and then other things I know that like I'm naturally better at? Is there things that
Yeah.
you found like that?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, you know, for me, I always thought about like my position in this movement is not necessarily to be a leader, but to be a supporter for those, because I've seen the fact that on one side is that activists shouldn't have to take the labor to explain something to someone,
Mm-hmm.
especially if they're already at the forefront of a lot of these movements, and you know, demanding their time can be stressful. While on the other hand, there's a lot of the people who didn't have the access or the privilege or resources to access this type of education. And so I think for myself, living in these experiences where I am a victim of someone who has experienced environmental injustices and someone who came from academia in that sense, I'm able to incorporate those lived experiences to give the chance and opportunity for those to interested in learning into intros of environmental topics
Mm-hmm.
into these multitudes of platforms. But also acknowledging for those wanting to do this work and learn is to acknowledge how BIPOC indigenous ancestral knowledge has always been at the forefront of environmental education.
Mm-hmm.
And so ensuring that, like, you know, if you're learning this with me, along with me, then I would expect or hope that you share this along with others, because
Yeah.
when we teach others about hope, we teach others about education, that empowers us to develop our own framework in the way that we want to move throughout this world. And so I think for me, that's part of like my role in the movement, is being a
Hmm.
huge supporter and empowering those around me, in my community to take action, whether it be whatever action. And I know what you mean, that you said like there's just so many issues sometimes that you just don't know where to focus. And so I tell people always to look into what they're most confidently able to engage in, for
Hmm.
years, not just a few weeks.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. And seeing, you know, you can get disheartened sometimes when you can't see immediate change, but you know, it takes like a long time, and that kind of patience and commitment, and sort of knowing, like recognizing when you do get burnt out or feel discouraged, you know, how can you best like rest for a second or still see that, you know, what you're doing is like worthwhile and hopeful. And I think too, I mean, you did a great video the other day that was talking about it was about veganism and the idea that like just because we make these choices, and you've kind of done videos around different subjects in similar ways, but like this idea that we obviously all have our own power over our choices to affect
Mm-hmm.
change. And if we decide to think, you know, if we decide certain elements that each fits our own, um, and maybe we have access or we don't have access to those choices, I think it's important that like they're not black and white, essentially.
Yeah.
You know, there's not like, just because you've chosen one thing doesn't necessarily mean that it's completely kind of perfect. And I think that imperfectness is really interesting. Like, it's better if, you know, billions of people did one small thing and weren't perfect, rather than like there were 1,000 perfect, most sustainable people you've ever met. That's not
Mm-hmm.
going to really change much. So I think, yeah, I mean, it'd be good if you maybe just could explain a little bit about what you said in that video. I think it was an interesting like example to show.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it got a lot of controversy from people because it's only 15 seconds, and so you
Hmm.
can't explain everything. But
Yeah.
what I was trying to get at is that veganism itself is, the person who coined it said that it was working towards the liberation of non-abuse for species, so
Hmm.
animals and humans. And so what we've seen today is that many animal activists focus on the liberation of animals. However, many don't separate or interconnect that environmental colonialism is interconnected to these types of industries. And
Hmm.
so, what I've tried to argue is that, cruelty free, although it may have meant, non animal products that are in the product, or no animals abused in the product, I think it's important to understand that the idea of cruelty and food is still rooted in the oppression of animals and humans. And
Hmm.
so I think what we're seeing today with like the natural wildfires, and seeing still that these workers have to like fear of being deported, fear of having access to mental and physical resources, and also deal with climate crisis wildfires while picking our produce, is that, it kind of ignores these types of peoples. And so I think for me, what I was trying to point out is that while we may think about living a vegan lifestyle is very, the best way to live in this environmental movement, I don't think necessarily it's the key to fix the whole climate crisis. It's part of it, of course, but I think that when we disregard who's making our food, it's erasing all the types of workers who have to do this labor. And so I think what I was trying to get at for vegans out there, was to really include intersectional veganism in their work, not just solely think of these issues as singular, issue
Hmm.
activism instead of multivariable issues.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really important point to make. And I think, you know, it's the same. I mean, it's like when you look at the obvious kind of thing, when you look at single use plastics, it's like the reusable water bottle, you know, whereas for a lot of people, they don't have access to clean tap water. So, like, it's all very well standing on a pedestal saying, like, how dare you buy bottled water? But at the same time, if that is not provided for people, then that is not an intersection of the issue. That means that you're taking everyone into account. So I think, yeah, it's just always important, I think, to just be like aware, I guess, of the multiple sides of the story. And yeah, I think obviously these fires that are happening right now in California, and you're seeing these kind of shocking images of farm workers working in, you know, near no visibility, extreme heat, like the conditions are terrible, and you know, they're not treated as essential workers, basically. Yeah, we wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
be, you know, we wouldn't have food on our tables if it wasn't for those people. So I think it's I think this year, obviously, there's been so many events that has just really highlighted the kind of massive disparity of kind of conditions, living conditions for people, and just like social community service that just doesn't, you know, exist for people's livelihoods, whether that's healthcare, whether, you know, it's childcare even. I think it's, I don't know what your experience has been during this year and how it's affected maybe plans you had, or things like that, or just uncovered things to you. I mean, I think it's been, for me, I found it like in an incredibly sort of shocking and like saddening year, but at the same time this kind of coming together of people in making the most out of the situation. And maybe like I've had more connections this year with people outside of kind of the echo chamber of my life, which, you know, we're all very aware of, we can exist in.
Yeah.
So I don't know what your experience has kind of been of this year.
No, yeah, no, that's really awesome. No, I think, yeah, during that time, you know, I had just like quit my job at an agency, and I was like, I don't want to work here for doing
Mm-hmm.
creative work anymore, and realized I wanted to change my career. But then COVID hit, and, you know, it changed all my plans. But one of the most important things that I realized is that the willingness of people, you know, say waking up or the willingness to learn increased.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that really showed to me the fact that these injustices are deeply embedded from decades of colonialism. And so now that people are realizing these interconnections, they're willing to invest in new ways of how to revolutionize themselves and
Mm-hmm.
develop tools for frameworks to empower themselves and their community. And so from what I've seen, you know, the demand for graphics on Instagram has increased.
Mm-hmm.
I necessarily never knew that was a thing. I knew
Yeah.
graphics existed, but I never knew that like educational graphics would become so popular today. And so during that time when I created this account a year ago, I didn't know that it would ever be in demand. And so I've seen personally that people are now wanting to talk about environmental racism more. Before in college, talking about environmental racism was a more of a quote unquote touchy subject or an uncomfortable subject for many classmates. And so I realized that whenever I would speak about it or be silenced by grad students or professors about it, I realized that now people are pushing forward for this environmental justice and environmental racism work. And so now I'm hoping that in modern environmental movements today, that more of this work is incorporated and embedded in our roots, whether it be through activism or forefront of conversations, or even corporations taking stance in these types of movements or slash
Mm-hmm.
statements, because it's undeniably true that all corporations or all individuals have impact within their own lifestyles or any type of work they do.
Yeah, and I think what's important about the research, like the surge of interest, I think what's going to be really interesting to see too is the commitment of that and like the follow through of those kind of things. I think, you know, there's obviously a huge just like uncovering of lack of inclusion, diversity, education, that like first step of awareness, you know, that you kind of go through, but then also that genuine commitment of not only just deciding to make sure the front facing of a company is kind of representative, but also behind that, like who sits at the heads of organizations, corporations, nonprofits, like until that really follows through. Like I think this continuing like kind of cancel kind of culture that is obviously existing, you wonder like
Mm-hmm.
how and what that will kind of unfold. I think it's just, I don't know, it's just a very interesting time to be alive for sure, just in terms of the how rapid things are happening and how kind of intense things can happen, which is good, you know. I think breaking through that, that's what's been really interesting. I feel that kind of those immediate things I can go to that feel uncomfortable just because that's so ingrained in my experience of like
Yeah.
shying away from things and you don't feel like you know, rather than pushing through it and being like, I should know, I need to know and ask the questions. I mean,
Yeah.
have you, like you said it when you were studying as a subject, it would kind of be a like sort of touchier subject talking about racism within environmental movement. Have you, I guess, what was that like? Was that frustrating to kind of feel like it was glazed over as a subject? And did you feel represented in your school or like by your educators? And how has that experience, I guess, continued in terms of professionally in your career now?
Yeah, no, I think for me, like within academia, when I was studying for environmental science, like one is the fact that most classes like you enter environmental science or classes, like predominantly students are white, and there's like very few percentage of people of color in those classes, and so
Mm.
I remember too, like many of the my department that I was in, 98% of the professors were white, and there was only I think 1 or 2% were people of color, and so
Mm.
that raised a lot of questions for students of like why this was the case. And so we looked into the board of who hires these university professors. It's all white men that are on the board. And
Yeah.
so, well, that's another issue. And so I think that when I was in school, I realized that like a lot of the students there only wanted to talk about topics that they were mostly comfortable with regarding conservation or going outdoors and heavy sciences that didn't really talk about race. And
Hmm.
so as I delved deeper into research and doing that, I remember my professor, or the person I was under the lab, told me I wish Mexicans were more invested in the environment. And so, you know, being at 19, I was so afraid to even speak about how that statement made me feel, mainly
Yeah.
because a lot of people of color are invested in environmentalism, just they're in different sectors. And so
Mhm.
I like during that time I was doing conservation research. And so, you know, we were looking at lizards in Miami, Florida. And so it took me years to kind of deconstruct what that meant, but I realized had I like if I were able to have the language and tools I had today, I would confront this person and tell them like the way of that statement was very problematic and the way that they really see environment and the interests of people of color invested in these majors. There's a lot of questions that you should be raising, like why is this the case? Why aren't people of color passing their classes in this major? What's being represented? And I think when I learned about environmental justice and racism, the course was taught by a white male professor, and
Mhm.
so I like was telling my friends during that time, like, oh, like why can't they even hire like a person of
Yeah.
color at least? Like, you know, and like the professor would just read the definition of what environmental justice meant from the EPA's website, which is
Right.
great, I guess, but it didn't really interconnect to what I experienced. And so
Yeah.
even in classes, like you had to deal with students that were saying like environmental racism isn't real or try to play what you would say devil's advocate. And so it was just draining to even have to prove your trauma or your health related issues to someone that's next to you and your peer about why this is real, and they didn't have to grow up with this. And so I think I realized during that time that academia wasn't the place for me to really
Mhm.
share those experiences and that thoughts because it never allowed me that space. But knowing that there was an organization there for diversity of students of color in the environmental space there, I think I leaned in with a lot of my peers and like
Mhm.
queer grad students that I found as like that were teaching the courses. I felt more confidently able to really trust them and talk to them about my experiences. That really held me down, instead of like having to deal with all these professors that are saying like this is how it should be taught, and if you don't invest in this environmental sector within economics or policy, we can't advance in this movement. And so I realized I had to deconstruct that elitism within me too, throughout that time.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, I think also it's like you say, it's great that you found those other spaces and communities to feel, safe and heard, and not to then also have to take on the role of being the educator. I think is also important. Not you, if you brought something up in class and then people kind of turning to you because you brought it up, being like, okay, you tell us then, and that's also not fair to pass the mic to someone just because it's their lived experience doesn't mean it's their responsibility as well to educate people. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's, other people's responsibility to show interest and like be curious to like seek experiences beyond their own. And I think, I mean, I guess with that, you just really hope that that teacher who taught that class will change, and those gatekeepers to the board of people who choose professors will change, and all these things that slowly, I feel like we're so still in the back end of that time. I think, in terms of we're still not quite like through this, like the more awake lived experience that maybe we're having because we surround ourselves with those people is changing, but like for that
Mm-hmm.
to truly like ripple down, I think it still and will take like time and work. um and yeah, I think, yeah, it's a shit. And also what that professor made the comment of, it's just like it's a terrible, I'm sorry that he said that. And I think it's interesting that he used the word like interested in a subject. It's like that comes from like privilege and passion to be interested in something. You know, it's still kind of like attached to ego rather than it being like
Mm-hmm.
a necessity of survival. It's not because I'm interested in it, but I'm being directly affected by it, is why people would get involved in it rather than it be a kind of, you know, an academic kind of romantic, almost weirdly view of a
Yeah.
subject rather than like a life and death reality of experience and like what's in your sort of end of your street and kind of thing. And I think, you know, even with, you know, with so many things, doesn't know, like fires, like these fires that are happening, you know, that fire doesn't know borders. Like it will
Mm-hmm.
burn through, you know, different neighborhoods and zones. And I think so quickly soon, you know, all these things that are affecting people won't know um, the borders of kind of demographics of people, kind of ethnicities of people. You know, I think even that with like sea level rising, I think, you know, there's obviously a big disparity of wealth of communities that live on the coast. You've got like highly extremely wealthy communities, and then you've got really low income, kind of very um, low infrastructure built communities that are on the coast.
Mm-hmm.
And I think obviously there are so many places that have been already directly affected by that. And I do wonder when places like Miami and things like that are so low of sea level yet highly expensive, densely populated neighborhoods, like how the tune will change
Yeah.
when everyone is affected or decision makers are like affected. And I think that's what's been interesting about the pandemic of COVID too.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
that like that it kind of, I don't know, it's just this uncontrollable sort of thing that's like that we can't literally see yet it's still happening.
Yeah.
um yeah, it's kind of an
It's
interesting
like it's affected everyone globally, that I think many people that are in shock still, or kind
mhm.
of like you would say fell into a state of sadness or loss because that was taken away from them. And I think
Yeah.
it makes them realize that the privileges they had that they
Hmm.
never really acknowledged. And so now they're just like, don't know how to react to it.
Yeah, exactly. And realizing how much freedom and choice we had to go about our day in the most simple
Mm-hmm.
way, taken away from you, and the kind of hopefully the resourcefulness or creativity that you have after that. I think, I don't know, I think that was what's been interesting. um I guess I would love to as well talk about some things, whether that's kind of like a takeaway of something that people could do to sort of like get more involved, or sort of talking about kind of, I was like talking about people's sort of relationship to hope in this, because obviously you're doing this every day with the work you do, and which is highly sort of you know, it's challenging. I know it's hard to like keep going and be hopeful. Or even is there something right now that you're kind of particularly interested in, whether that's like a campaign or something that you're really trying to communicate? I know that's like about three questions I asked you,
No,
but yeah.
no, thank you so much, Bonnie. I think for me, I guess like things that I'm interested right now is that I am writing a climate illustrated book, and so
Cool.
what I want to do is provide those free books or PDFs to schools around that are
Mm-hmm.
public here in Los Angeles, and so I'm actually partnering up right now with a teacher in Los Angeles to do this, and so. I've always believed in never having a privatized education,
Mm-hmm.
and so having like open education and just having it for the people is much better, because I think that, you know, I at a younger age would have loved to see something that was very simplistic, designed and like written out, and I was like, okay, now I get it. And so, you know, had I like not had that foundation of my education before, I don't know where I would have been. And so now that I have this education, I think about people that are older than me, people who are younger than me, people who are my age that are finally learning about climate education or environmental education. And so thinking about those things. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think the most important takeaway too for that is those that are just don't know where to start. I think
Mm-hmm.
start with your own the ways that you grew up. I think a lot of us have environmental values that our parents have instilled in us,
Mm-hmm.
whether it be like through reusing products or talking about culture or going through trips that you've gone through. Like a lot of us have environmental memories within ourselves, and so reconnecting to how that felt and realizing how it looks today. Like I think there was this great quote saying like, to think like I was growing up in the 90s as a child, and to think that, even then things were getting worse, but it wasn't as bad now. And so to think that at a younger self, people my age don't have those privileges anymore to live that experience. And
Mm-hmm.
so it makes me almost traumatized, but always sometimes empowered to be like, now I have the responsibility to know that I have to empower others around me. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think talking to family is a really great step, and friends and neighbors, because I think sometimes people are so scared to be like, what do I do online? I'm scared to be judged. I'm scared to go to this protest. Start with your friends and family, because most often not, they also have shared similar values to you, or
Mm-hmm.
slash you're willing to challenge them, because I think tough conversations are needed, but
Mm-hmm.
also you can have empowering conversations within them.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. That's great. You're doing the book. I mean, it is just so many things start at school. Like for me, my interest in sort of and my curiosities of the subjects I'm into started like, when I was really young, like before the age of
Mm-hmm.
10, that kind of really informative time where, at least, there are so many situations that we can't sort of know about or control for people's family environment. Yet you go to school and it's this consistent sort of hopefully safe place where you can be inspired and you can have role models within your teachers and your peers,
Mm-hmm.
and I think there's so much that we can do in that time. And sadly, obviously, the resources and funding for things can be lacking. And I think if there is like things that and resources that people can use or teachers can use, then I think it's like really and engaging in a way that like kids want to read it and they're not overwhelmed by it, and they can know about who wrote it and feel represented by the person who's written it or see themselves in you as the
Mm-hmm.
author of it. I think is really important to have. Yeah, I think education and I guess that is the beauty of the internet and
Yeah.
here and Instagram and all those things. It's like it's a bit more, it creates a bit more of a kind of level playing field for people to kind of like get involved, whether it's like privately watching this or whether it's in a public sense of us talking. There's like many different roles to do.
Yeah.
And when do
No,
you
yeah.
will that take on, do you know when that will be? Is that like a long-term project, the book?
No, so it's only a version one, so it's a small book, so it's not
Mm-hmm.
like a large book or anything that, but hopefully to release it in November. My designer right now, we're almost done with the designs and
Cool.
just have an editor to edit all the writings and stuff. And so, oh, sorry about that.
Ooh,
Um,
disconnected. Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, great. So it comes out in
So
November. That's cool.
yeah, so I guess we're just, yeah, yeah, so it'll be really exciting, but yeah, oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
Oh, it's frozen. Could be my internet. My internet's not great. But yeah, cool. Well, I also just encourage everyone to go over and follow Isaias and watch your, I feel like all the videos you've done, the real videos, and which I haven't even managed to master. I don't even know how to do a real video. So you're more
Yeah.
tech savvy than me. But yeah, I think also there's the beauty of all these kind of graphics and infographics. It really is the way that people like share things. Like we've used, like almost beginning to use Instagram as like our news
Mm,
educational feed. Which is great that we can curate that. So thank you so much for
yeah.
sharing sort of your story and your interests, and thank you, yeah, for taking the
Yeah,
time.
thank you so much, Bon. It was such a privilege to even talk to you. I was just thinking
Yeah.
about like how I watched the movies at a younger age, and I was like, I
Yeah.
never would have thought this. So thank you so much
Yeah,
again.
of course. No, I'm pleased that we can sort of like steer the conversation into interesting
Yeah.
things, but I'm always very respectful of like, I know the platform I have and like why it is, and I think I
Mhm.
always am so inspired by every time I post things about sort of the climate crisis or change or environmentalism. I'm always like really so like excited when I see
Yeah.
people um, getting inspired by it and like taking it one step further by like looking into things themselves. So it makes me excited, like the engagement that I really do get with these subjects, because I think it's everyone's lived experience. People can't like deny it anymore, what's happening to the planet
Hmm.
and its intersection of like people. So I think it's really good to have these conversations. So thanks for your input.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, thank you so much, Bonnie.
Yeah. Have a good day.
You too. Bye.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.